The night I saw my daughter-in-law wearing my late wife's necklace, my entire world stopped. That necklace wasn't just gold and stones. It was my wife's memory, her soul, her love, all wrapped into one. And to watch it being flaunted like a cheap trophy in front of strangers, it felt like betrayal had carved its way straight into my heart. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. After my wife passed, life was never the same. I lived in silence most days, walking through rooms that once carried her laughter, hearing echoes of a voice that would never return. In the middle of that emptiness, the jewelry box she left behind became more than an ornament. It was my connection to her spirit. Every necklace, every bracelet, every ring telling its own story of the life we had built together. I would open the box sometimes late at night, not to wear them, not even to touch them, but to simply remember. Those jewels were the closest thing I had left to her presence. Protecting them wasn't about wealth, it was about keeping her memory alive. When my son got married, I had hope again. I thought his wife would bring new joy into our home, maybe even fill some of the quiet spaces that grief had left behind. But I soon realized she was different. My daughter-in-law cared about appearances more than substance. She always wanted to look richer, grander, more important than she was. At first, I dismissed it as youthful vanity. After all, many young people care too much about status. I told myself it was harmless. But slowly, her little remarks began to pierce my patience. She would comment on how small our home was compared to her cousin's mansion, how plain our dinners looked when photographed, how simple my life seemed without extravagance. I could see it in her eyes, envy mixed with dissatisfaction. And then, one day, I noticed her gaze linger on the jewelry box. She tried to mask it with a smile, but I knew the look of desire when I saw it. I told myself I was imagining things. Perhaps she only admired it the way one admires an artifact in a museum. Yet in my heart, I felt a chill. My wife's treasures were sacred, not toys for display. I wanted to believe my daughter-in-law respected that, respected me, respected the memory of the woman whose presence still filled this home. But little did I know, the temptation was already burning inside her, and soon, that fire would consume the fragile trust I had left. She began showing her true nature little by little, in ways that at first seemed harmless, but soon became impossible to ignore. At dinners, she would casually mention how her friends had bigger houses, flashier cars, richer husbands. When her family came to visit, she would walk them through my home as if it were beneath her, making subtle comments about how she wished things were more modern, or how wonderful it would be to renovate everything. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't hear her words, but because I loved my son too much to create conflict. He looked at her with the same wide-eyed devotion I once had for my wife, and I couldn't bring myself to shatter that illusion. So I swallowed my pride and kept silent, convincing myself that if I endured, peace in the family would survive. But silence only fed her hunger. My daughter-in-law had an obsession with appearances that could never be satisfied. Whenever we went to gatherings, she compared herself to others. If someone had a new dress, she needed a better one. If someone wore gold earrings, she whispered to my son about buying her diamonds. She was never content. Her eyes glistened whenever wealth was mentioned, and her smile widened only when others admired her. In her mind, life was not about love or respect. It was about outshining everyone else, even her own family. I tried to remind myself that she was young, that perhaps she would change as time passed. But my instincts told me otherwise. I noticed the way her gaze often wandered to the wooden box on the dresser in my room, the one that held my wife's jewelry. She thought I didn't see her, but a father's eyes miss nothing. She lingered just a second too long whenever the box was near, her curiosity sharp, her desire barely hidden. My heart tightened every time, because I knew she wasn't admiring beauty. She was calculating possession. One evening, I accidentally left the box slightly open after revisiting it. The next morning, I found it closed, but not the way I usually left it. I knew my habits. I had cared for that box like a ritual for years. My fingers brushed against the lid, and I felt a difference, as though someone else's hands had been there. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps my imagination clouded by grief, but deep down, I sensed the first crack in the wall of trust. For my son's sake, I looked away. For the sake of harmony, I let it pass. But the unease never left me. Every smile she gave seemed rehearsed. Every compliment she made felt like a veil hiding something darker. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed her greed would never stretch far enough to touch what I held most sacred. But prayers are sometimes ignored, and what started as a lingering gaze was only the beginning of a storm I never wanted to face. The jewelry box was not just wood and velvet, it was a treasury of memories, a sanctuary of moments that no thief should ever touch. My wife had polished each piece with love, and I remembered the stories behind them all. The delicate pearl earrings she wore on our first anniversary, the golden bangles she received from her mother on the day of our wedding, the ruby ring she proudly displayed when our son was born. Each jewel carried a heartbeat, a whisper from the past, a fragment of a love that time itself could not erase. When I opened that box, I wasn't looking at ornaments. I was looking at a life built with devotion, sacrifice, and unshakable loyalty. I often sat alone in my room, holding those jewels and drifting into memories. I could still hear my wife's laughter as she adjusted her necklace before a celebration, still see her eyes sparkle as she slipped on a bracelet before leaving for a family gathering. She would tease me, saying, "One day our daughter-in-law will wear these too." Those words haunted me now, because she could never have imagined the woman who entered our home, a woman whose love for appearance outweighed her respect for legacy. My wife had spoken those words with hope, but fate twisted them into something bitter. At first, my daughter-in-law's curiosity seemed innocent. I once caught her staring at the box when she thought no one was looking. She asked casual questions about the pieces, pretending admiration. "These must be so valuable," she said with a smile that felt too sharp, too eager. I answered gently, reminding her that their value was not in money, but in the memories they carried. But her eyes betrayed her. She didn't care for memories. She cared for status, for the weight of admiration that jewels could buy her. One afternoon, I found the box slightly ajar again, though I was certain I had locked it. My heart raced, but when I looked inside, everything was still there. At least I thought so. I brushed it off, telling myself perhaps I was becoming forgetful. But the way the velvet lining had been disturbed, the way one necklace was resting just a little out of place, whispered otherwise. Someone had touched what was not theirs. Still, I stayed silent. I convinced myself I had no proof, that accusing her without evidence would destroy my son's peace. I reminded myself of the vow I made to protect those jewels for the sake of my wife's memory. I told myself silence was strength, that patience was wisdom. But silence is a dangerous companion, because it can give the greedy enough time to sharpen their claws, and in my silence, I did not realize she was already planning her theft, already picturing herself basking in the glory of jewels that were never hers to claim. It happened quietly, like a shadow slipping across the floor, so subtle I almost doubted myself at first. My son had invited his in-laws over for dinner, and the house was buzzing with conversation and the clinking of plates. I watched from my seat at the table as my daughter-in-law entered the room, her chin high, her smile wide, and her dress chosen with care. But what struck me wasn't her dress or her posture. It was the gleam around her neck. My eyes froze. There, against her skin, shone the very necklace my wife wore on our wedding day, the necklace I had promised myself would never leave that box. My chest tightened, and the noise of the room faded into silence. At first, I told myself I was mistaken. Maybe it only looked similar under the light. Maybe I was letting grief distort my vision. But as she moved closer, I saw the tiny dent in the clasp, the one my wife had laughed about when she accidentally dropped it years ago. It was unmistakable. There was no doubt. She had taken it. And she wasn't hiding it. She was flaunting it, showing it proudly to her family, letting them marvel at her beauty as though the necklace were her own. My hands trembled under the table. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but I stayed still, swallowing my rage like poison. Her relatives leaned in, admiring her. "You look so elegant," one of them said, their eyes lingering on the necklace. She touched it lightly, as if it were hers by right, and smiled in satisfaction. My son beamed at her, too blinded by love to see the truth, too enchanted to notice the theft staring him in the face. I clenched my fists, feeling as though I was losing not only my wife's memory, but my son's loyalty as well. To accuse her in that moment would have caused chaos, and I had no proof but what my own eyes had seen. So I sat in silence, watching her bask in the glow of lies. That night, after everyone left, I went to the box. The necklace was gone. The empty spot in the velvet lining screamed louder than words ever could. I stood there, staring at it, my heart breaking all over again. She had crossed the line I prayed she would never cross. And yet, I said nothing. I told myself perhaps it was temporary. Perhaps she only borrowed it without realizing the pain it carried for me, but deep inside, I knew better. I knew that what I had witnessed was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was betrayal, deliberate and cruel. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I could feel the storm gathering, waiting for the moment it would finally break. The first time could have been dismissed as my imagination, but the second time tore away every shred of doubt. My son and his wife were invited to a large family celebration at her parents' house, and I reluctantly agreed to join them. I arrived quietly, carrying the weight of my grief as I always did, trying to endure the endless chatter of relatives. And then, across the crowded room, I saw her. She stood near the center, her head tilted proudly, her smile wide, her laughter sharp. But it wasn't her laughter that cut through me. It was the shimmer resting against her collarbone. My wife's necklace again, glinting, under the warm lights, displayed as though it had always belonged to her. This time, there was no mistaking it. I saw the same tiny flaw in the clasp, the same subtle bend where my wife once caught it on her sari. The memories flooded back, the way my wife's eyes lit up when I placed it around her neck on our wedding day, how she had blushed when relatives admired it, how she whispered to me later that it wasn't the necklace she loved, but the way I looked at her while she wore it. And now, that sacred piece of her was being paraded around like a cheap accessory, stripped of its soul, worn without shame by a woman who knew nothing of its meaning. Her relatives surrounded her, their admiration feeding her ego. They gasped, they praised, they told her how lucky she was to be so well taken care of. She basked in it all, touching the necklace gently, tilting her head so it caught the light just right. My heart throbbed with rage. Each compliment aimed at her felt like an insult to my wife, a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I sat in the corner, silent, unseen, my fists clenched so tightly my nails cut into my palms. I thought of standing up right then, of tearing the necklace from her throat and telling everyone the truth. I imagined their shocked faces, their whispers, the shame burning her cheeks. But I stayed seated. My son's happiness held me down. He looked at her with love, with pride, completely blind to the theft she had committed. If I exposed her then, I would shatter him in front of everyone, and though my anger begged for it, my heart was not ready to break him. So I swallowed my pain, letting it burn inside me like fire. When the evening ended and I returned home, I went straight to the jewelry box. The empty space stared back at me, confirming what my eyes had already seen. I touched the velvet where the necklace once lay, and felt tears sting my eyes. It was no longer about an ornament. It was about respect, about love, about the memory of a woman I had vowed to protect, even in death. And now that promise was being broken, not by strangers, but by my own family. That night I knew. This was not a mistake. This was war. That night I could not sleep. I sat alone in the dim glow of a single lamp, staring at the empty spot in the jewelry box where the necklace once lay. My hands hovered above it, trembling, remembering the weight of that chain, the warmth of my wife's skin as I clasped it around her neck all those years ago. Memories came rushing in like a flood, each one sharper than the last. I saw her on our wedding day, her eyes glistening with tears as she whispered, "You've made me the happiest woman alive." I saw her on our anniversaries, smiling shyly as I teased her about how beautiful she looked. I saw her holding our newborn son, the necklace catching the sunlight as if it too was celebrating new life. Every memory was vivid, alive, until it clashed with the image of my daughter-in-law parading that same necklace as though it were nothing more than a costume. I closed my eyes, trying to push the image away, but the betrayal clung to me. It wasn't just about jewelry. It was about desecrating the memory of a woman who had given her all to this family. My wife had endured struggles with me, stood by me in poverty, rejoiced with me in moments of triumph. She never cared for gold or wealth. She cared for the bond we shared, the laughter we created, the love we built. That necklace wasn't a display of riches. It was a symbol of a love story. And now that symbol had been twisted into a cheap prop, flaunted to earn empty admiration from people who didn't even know its story. I felt torn between grief and rage. Grief for my wife, for her memory being stolen. Rage for the woman who dared to wear what was never hers. I thought of my son, how blind he seemed, how completely lost in the glow of his wife's charm. Did he not see the theft? Did he not question how she suddenly adorned herself with heirlooms she never earned? Or was he so entranced by her smiles that truth no longer mattered? That thought wounded me even more deeply, because it wasn't just the daughter-in-law who betrayed me, it was my own blood who stood beside her, unknowingly allowing this insult to continue. I sat in silence for hours, replaying the past. Every moment with my wife felt like a jewel itself, something priceless that no thief could truly steal, and yet I couldn't shake the image of that necklace glittering on another woman's chest. The anger boiled inside me, simmering into something darker. For the first time since my wife's passing, I felt a fire that grief alone could not extinguish. I realized that this betrayal wasn't going to stop on its own, and if I continued to stay silent, her memory would be erased piece by piece, until there was nothing left of her but dust. Days turned into weeks, and my daughter-in-law's boldness grew like a weed left unchecked. The necklace had been only the beginning. Soon she began wearing other pieces, my wife's gold bangles, her sapphire earrings, even the delicate pearl set that held the memory of our first anniversary. Each time she appeared with them, she wore them as though they had always belonged to her, moving gracefully in front of her relatives, basking in their endless compliments. She smiled wider when they praised her elegance, and each word of admiration seemed to feed her pride. I watched quietly, my heart breaking anew each time, as if I was losing my wife all over again. What stung the most was the way people around her spoke. "She must be so lucky to marry into such wealth," they said, glancing at the jewels she displayed. "Her husband has given her everything." Those words cut me deeper than any knife. They weren't just praising her, they were erasing my wife. Every story, every sacrifice, every ounce of love attached to those jewels vanished beneath her false glory. She had stolen not only the ornaments, but the history they carried, presenting them as trophies of her own worth. And my son, blind in his devotion, smiled proudly at her side, never questioning, never noticing the shadows beneath her beauty. At night, I would open the jewelry box and see the empty spaces growing. The velvet lining that once cradled my wife's treasures now mocked me with gaps and hollows. I ran my fingers over them, remembering where each piece once lay, remembering the moments they symbolized. My chest tightened, my eyes burned, and my heart whispered a truth I could no longer ignore. If I stayed silent, soon the box would be empty, and with it, my wife's memory would vanish from this world. I wrestled with myself, torn between love for my son and the duty I felt to my wife's legacy. Part of me wanted to believe my daughter-in-law would stop, that maybe she didn't understand the weight of what she had taken. But another part of me, the part that watched her preen in front of her family, knew she understood perfectly well. She didn't just want the jewels, she wanted the admiration, the recognition, the illusion of grandeur, and she would keep taking until nothing was left. That was when something inside me began to change. I realized that silence was no longer an option. Each day she wore those jewels, she wasn't just stealing gold, she was stealing the honor of the woman I loved, the foundation of the family we built, and I could not allow that to continue. Revenge began to take root in my heart, quiet but unshakable. I would wait, I would watch, and when the moment came, I would tear the mask from her face in front of everyone she sought to impress. She wanted glory, but I would give her shame. I found myself living in two worlds, the one I showed to my son and his wife, and the one that burned quietly inside me. Outwardly, I was calm, silent, the old man who kept to his room, who smiled faintly at family dinners and spoke little. But within me, a storm brewed that refused to be silenced. I replayed every moment I had seen her flaunt my wife's jewels, every careless laugh, every boastful tilt of her chin. Each memory was a spark, and together they set fire to my soul. I wanted to scream at her, to rip the jewelry from her, and demand she confess the truth. But rage alone would not be enough. If I let my anger explode, she would deny it, twist the story, make me look like a bitter old man. No, this betrayal required a revenge so precise, so undeniable, that it would leave no escape for her. I wrestled with my conscience. I asked myself, could I forgive her? Could I let this pass, all for the sake of my son's peace? For nights, I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining what my wife would say if she were here. She was kind, gentle, forgiving. Perhaps she would have told me to let it go, that the jewels were only objects, but my heart knew better. They were not just objects, they were pieces of her soul, pieces of us, and my daughter-in-law was parading them like trinkets. Forgiveness would mean allowing her to erase my wife's presence. Forgiveness would mean betraying the woman who gave me everything. Once I accepted that, my thoughts turned sharper. What punishment would wound her most? I considered the law, but that would drag my son into disgrace and scandal. I considered locking the jewels away, but she had already sighs. Stolen enough to mock me. Then the answer became clear. She wanted admiration, wanted her relatives to see her as grand and powerful. That vanity was her weakness, and weakness, once exposed, destroys even the proudest. So I began to plan. I waited patiently, biding my time, speaking little so no one suspected the storm within me. I observed her habits, the way she chose which piece to wear, depending on who was visiting, the way she timed her entrances to capture attention. I realized she had built her reputation on lies, and all it would take was one strike of truth to shatter it completely. I decided that at the next family gathering, when her audience was largest, I would end her charade. I would not scream or accuse in private where she could twist the story. I would expose her mask in the very spotlight she craved. The thought both calmed and excited me. For the first time since my wife's passing, I felt a sense of purpose again. Not joy, not peace, but purpose. My revenge would not be cruel for cruelty's sake. It would be justice, long overdue. The day of the gathering arrived like a storm I had been waiting for. It was a celebration hosted at our home, a dinner meant to honor visiting relatives from her side of the family. My son was excited, bustling about, making sure everything was perfect. My daughter-in-law, however, was radiant with anticipation, far more concerned with how she would appear than with the event itself. I watched her from the corner of the room as she prepared, her fingers gliding over the velvet box she thought I no longer paid attention to. She chose the earrings this time, my wife's sapphire earrings, the very ones she had worn the night of our 20th anniversary. I remembered that evening so clearly. My wife had stood by my side, those sapphires glistening like two stars framing her smile. And now they dangled from the ears of someone who knew nothing about the love they represented, wearing them only to bask in shallow compliments. She spent hours getting ready, trying on dresses, adjusting her hair, tilting her head in the mirror to see how the light caught the gems. I could almost hear her thoughts. How many praises would she receive tonight? How many admiring eyes would follow her? How much higher her status would climb in her relatives' estimation? Every movement she made reeked of vanity, and yet, to my son, she was perfect. He walked in, saw her sparkling, and smiled with pride. "You look stunning," he said, not realizing he was admiring stolen memories. My heart ached for him, for his blindness, for the way he had been bewitched by her charm. As evening fell, the house filled with voices and laughter. Relatives gathered, children ran about, and the aroma of food drifted through the air. I sat quietly, watching, waiting. She moved gracefully among the guests, her earrings flashing, her laughter ringing louder than anyone else's. Compliments poured over her like rain, and so he soaked them in, smiling wider with each word. "You're so lucky," they told her. "Your husband must be so generous." She tilted her head proudly, accepting their admiration as if she had earned it. My fists tightened under the table, but I remained calm. Tonight was not for anger. Tonight was for truth. Every glance, every whisper, every false smile was fuel for my resolve. I knew the moment was coming, the perfect moment to strike. And when it did, it would not be with fists or fury. It would be with words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. She thought she was safe, hidden beneath layers of lies and jewels that weren't hers. But I was watching, and soon everyone else would be too. The moment came when the room was at its warmest, when the laughter was loudest, and the admiration for her was at its peak. My daughter-in-law stood in the center, her head tilted back slightly, so that the sapphire earrings caught the light. Her relatives surrounded her, their eyes glistening with envy and admiration. My son, poor boy, looked at her as though she were the sun itself, proud and blind. I sat in silence, my glass in my hand, my heart thundering in my chest. Every second I waited, the fire inside me burned hotter. I had endured enough. The memory of my wife, the sanctity of her treasures, the dignity of her life, they all demanded justice. And so I rose to my feet. The room quieted just enough for my voice to carry. I raised my glass high, my eyes fixed on her, and said, "Do you all admire her beauty tonight? Do you see how those jewels sparkle?" Heads turned, smiles grew, and voices murmured agreement. My daughter-in-law smiled wider, certain I was about to praise her, certain the old man who said little had finally recognized her brilliance. But then I let the truth fall like a stone into water. "Those earrings," I said slowly, "do not belong to her. They belong to my wife. They were gifts of love, treasures of memory, and tonight you see them stolen and displayed as trophies. The words cut through the air like thunder. For a heartbeat, the room froze. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered, her color drained. A hush fell over the gathering, broken only by gasps and whispers. She stammered, her hands flying to her ears as if to hide the evidence. "That's not true," she tried to say, but the crack in her voice betrayed her. Her relatives stared, their admiration melting into suspicion, their whispers growing sharper. "Stolen?" one muttered. "From his wife?" another asked. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. My calmness was louder than any rage. "She parades my wife's memory as her own," I continued, my voice steady. "She craves your praise, but it is built on lies. Every jewel she wears is not hers by right, but by theft. You applaud her elegance, but what you see is betrayal hidden beneath glitter." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. My daughter-in-law's face burned with shame, her eyes darting wildly as though searching for someone to defend her, but none did. Even my son stood frozen, his mouth half open, the realization dawning on him in painful fragments. She trembled, trapped in the very spotlight she had sought so desperately. In that moment, the admiration she lived for collapsed around her, and I knew I had struck the blow that would strip her of the mask she had worn for too long. The silence after my words was unbearable, yet more satisfying than any applause. My daughter-in-law stood frozen, her hands clutching the earrings as though she could somehow make them disappear. The same relatives who had been praising her only moments ago now stared with wide eyes. Their admiration turned to disbelief. I watched their faces shift, first confusion, then suspicion, and finally, contempt. A cousin whispered to another, "So it wasn't hers at all," and that single murmur spread through the crowd like fire in dry grass. She tried to speak, to salvage her dignity. "He's mistaken," she stammered, her voice trembling. "They were given to me. My husband, he—" But her words collapsed beneath the weight of my calm gaze. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to argue. Truth had already revealed itself, and denial only made her look smaller. She searched for my son's eyes, desperate for rescue, but he stood paralyzed, his face pale, his pride shattered. I saw him glance at the earrings, then at me, and in that instant, I knew he recognized them. He knew his mother's treasures when he saw them, and the dawning realization broke him in a way I could never have prepared for. The whispers grew louder. Women shook their heads in disgust. Men muttered about shame and greed. One elderly aunt stood up and said sharply, "To steal from the dead, there is no forgiveness for that." My daughter-in-law's face burned crimson. She tugged at the earrings, fumbling to remove them, but her hands shook so violently they nearly slipped from her fingers. When she finally dropped them into her palm, the sound of metal clinking was louder than thunder in that hushed room. She held them awkwardly, unable to meet anyone's eyes, her arrogance crumbling into dust. I sat back down slowly, my glass untouched, my breathing steady. There was no satisfaction in gloating, only a quiet justice. I had not needed to raise my hand or call the police or start a fight. All it took was a few words in the right moment, and her empire of lies collapsed. She stood before her relatives no longer as the elegant woman she pretended to be, but as a thief, a liar, a fraud. The shame clung to her like a heavy cloak, and no amount of excuses could tear it away. The rest of the evening dragged on in uneasy silence. Conversations shifted awkwardly, eyes avoided hers, and laughter never returned. My son barely spoke, his shoulders hunched, his mind trapped in turmoil. My daughter-in-law sat in the corner, her once proud head bowed, stripped of the glory she craved. For the first time since her arrival into my family, she had no power, no admirers, no mask to hide behind. The jewels she had stolen to build her image had instead become the very chains that exposed her to the world. The fallout began the moment the last guest left our home. The silence between my son and his wife was louder than any shouting match could ever be. He walked ahead of her, his shoulders heavy, his head bowed, while she trailed behind, her face streaked with tears and shame. I watched them from my chair, my heart torn between sorrow for my son and grim satisfaction that the truth had finally been spoken. For once, she had no words to twist, no charm to wield. Her silence was her confession, and her disgrace lingered in every corner of the house. The next days were thick with tension. My son avoided me, ashamed not only of her, but of himself for not seeing it sooner. When he did speak, his words were short, clipped, as though he struggled to balance his love for his wife with the truth that had been laid bare. I pitied him. He was a man caught between loyalty and betrayal, between the father who raised him and the woman he chose. And my daughter-in-law, she no longer walked with her chin high. She moved quietly through the house, her footsteps hesitant, her eyes lowered, as though the walls themselves judged her. But humiliation has a way of traveling beyond four walls. Word of what had happened spread through the community faster than I could have imagined. Relatives spoke, neighbors whispered, and soon her once admiring circle turned cold. Invitations stopped coming, glances turned sharp, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She had sought to impress them with borrowed glory, but now she was known for what she truly was, a woman who stole from her own family, from the dead, to feed her vanity. The respect she had craved had curdled into ridicule, and there was no undoing it. At meals, the silence was suffocating. My son tried to eat in peace, but his eyes often darted to the empty spaces in the jewelry box whenever he passed my room. He knew now the truth of what she had done. I could see the cracks in their marriage forming, not from my words, but from the shame she carried and the disappointment he felt. She tried once or twice to justify herself, whispering excuses in the dark, but excuses cannot mend trust once it is broken. He listened, but his silence was answer enough. For me, there was no joy in watching their marriage falter. I had not wanted to destroy my son's happiness. I had only wanted to protect my wife's memory. Yet betrayal has consequences that ripple outward, touching everyone in its path. My daughter-in-law thought she could rise higher by stealing what was not hers, but all she had done was drag herself and my son into the depths of disgrace. And as I watched them struggle in the aftermath, I understood that revenge was never about cruelty. It was about truth. And truth has a way of breaking what is false beyond repair. In the days that followed, I found myself sitting longer in the quiet of my room, the jewelry box resting before me. The spaces were still there, empty where her greedy hands had reached, but they no longer screamed at me with the same pain. For the first time since my wife's passing, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Not joy, not celebration, but peace. My daughter-in-law had stolen ornaments, yes, but she had also stolen dignity, honor, memory. By exposing her, I had given all of that back to my wife. The jewels no longer belonged to vanity. They returned to where they were meant to be, in memory, in truth, in love. My son remained quiet, burdened by disappointment, yet I could see in his eyes that he finally understood. He didn't need me to explain further. The truth had spoken for itself in that room full of relatives. He saw her clearly now, not through the haze of infatuation, but through the lens of betrayal. Whether he chose to forgive her or not was his burden to carry, but at least he would never again be blind. And as for her, she moved through the world with her head bowed, stripped of the admiration she once chased so desperately. She had wanted glory, but she had earned only shame. I never sought the law. I never sought punishment beyond what she created for herself. My revenge was not written on paper or shouted in courtrooms. It was written in whispers, in the eyes of her relatives, in the silence that followed her wherever she went. Her punishment was not prison. It was the collapse of the very image she had tried to build. That was justice enough. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine my wife watching. I imagine her smile, not of sadness, but of relief. Relief that her memory had not been erased, that her story still lived in me, unbroken. And I whisper to her that I kept my promise, that even in death I protected what was hers. Betrayal can wound deeply, but truth has its own power. When spoken at the right time, it does not just expose lies, it destroys them completely. And so I end this story with a lesson. Betrayal may come from those closest to you, but silence is not always strength. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is to speak the truth, no matter how much it hurts. I did not destroy her with fists or with rage. I destroyed her with honesty, and that honesty restored my wife's dignity. Before you go, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps us continue sharing stories like this one, stories of betrayal, of justice, and of truth.